Chapter 17 of The Danger Trail. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Roger Melisse. The Danger Trail by James Oliver Curwood. Chapter 17. Melisse. For many minutes Howland stood waiting as if life had left him. His eyes were on the door, but unseeing. He made no sound, no movement again toward the aperture in the wall. Fate had dealt him the final blow, and when at last he roused himself from its first terrible effect, there remained no glimmering of hope in his breast, no thought of the battle he had been making for freedom a short time before. The note fluttered from his fingers, and he drew his watch from his pocket and placed it on the table. It was 5:15. There still remained 45 minutes. 3/4 of an hour, and then death. There was no doubt in his mind this time. Even in the coyote, with eternity staring him in the face, he had hoped and fought for life. But here there was no hope. There was to be no fighting. Through one of the black holes in the wall he was to be shot down, with no chance to defend himself, to prove himself innocent. And Melisse, did she too believe him guilty of that crime? He groaned aloud, and picked up the note again. Softly he repeated her last words to him. "If God fails to answer my prayers, I will still do as I have promised, and follow you." Those words seemed to cry aloud his doom. Even Melisse had given up hope. And yet, was there not a deeper significance in her words? He started as if someone had struck him, his eyes agleam. "I will follow you." He almost sobbed the words this time. His hands trembled and he dropped the paper again on the table, and turned his eyes in staring horror toward the door. What did she mean? Would Melisse kill herself if he was murdered by her brothers? He could see no other meaning in her last message to him, and for a time after the chilling significance of her words struck his heart, he scarce restrained himself from calling aloud for Jean. If he could but send a word back to her, tell her once more of his great love, that the winning of that love was ample reward for all he had lost and was about to lose, and that it gave him such happiness as he had never known even in this last hour of his torture. Twice he shouted for Croisset, but there came no response save the hollow echoings of his own voice in the subterranean chambers. After that he began to think more sanely. If Melisse was a prisoner in her room, it was probable that Croisset, who was now fully recognized as a traitor at the post, could no longer gain access to her. In some secret way Melisse had contrived to give him the note, and he had performed his last mission for her. In Howland's breast there grew strongly a feeling of sympathy for the Frenchman. Much that he had not understood was clear to him now. He understood why Melisse had not revealed the names of his assailants at Prince Albert and Wekusko. He understood why she had fled from him after his abduction, and why Jean had so faithfully kept secrecy for her sake. She had fought to save him from her own flesh and blood, and Jean had fought to save him, and in these last minutes of his life he would like to have had Croisset with him, that he might have taken his hand and thanked him for what he had done. And because he had fought for him and Melisse, the Frenchman's fate was to be almost as terrible as his own. It was he who would fire the fatal shot at 6 o'clock. Not the brothers, but Jean Croisset would be his executioner and murderer. The minutes passed swiftly, and as they went Howland was astonished to find how coolly he awaited the end. He even began to debate with himself as to through which hole the fatal shot would be fired. No matter where he stood, he was in the light of the big hanging lamp. There was no obscure or shadowy corner in which for a few moments he might elude his executioner. He even smiled when the thought occurred to him that it was possible to extinguish the light and crawl under the table, thus gaining a momentary delay. But what would that delay avail him? He was anxious for the fatal minute to arrive and be over. There were moments of happiness when in the damp horror of his death chamber there came before him visions of Mélisse, grown even sweeter and more lovable, now that he knew how she had sacrificed herself between two great loves, the love of her own people and the love of himself. And at last she had surrendered to him. Was it possible that she could have made that surrender if she, like her brothers, believed him to be the murderer of her father, the son of the man fiend who had robbed her of a mother? It was impossible, he told himself. She did not believe him guilty. And yet, why had she not given him some such word in her last message to him? His eyes traveled to the note on the table, and he began searching in his coat pockets. In one of them he found the worn stub of a pencil, and for many minutes after that he was oblivious to the passing of time as he wrote his last words to Mélisse. When he had finished he folded the paper and placed it under his watch. At the final moment, before the shot was fired, he would ask Jean to take it. His eyes fell on his watch dial, and a cry burst from his lips. It lacked but 10 minutes of the final hour. Above him he heard faintly the sharp barking of dogs, the hollow sound of men's voices. A moment later there came to him an echo as of swiftly tramping feet, and after that silence. "Jean!" he called tensely. "Ho, Jean! Jean Croisset!" He caught up the paper and ran from one black opening to another, calling the Frenchman's name. "As you love your God, Jean, as you have a hope of heaven, take this note to Mélisse," he pleaded. "Jean! Jean Croisset!" There came no answer, no movement outside, and Howland stilled the beating of his heart to listen. Surely Croisset was there. He looked again at the watch he held in his hand. In 4 minutes the shot would be fired. A cold sweat bathed his face. He tried to cry out again, but something rose in his throat and choked him until his voice was only a gasp. He sprang back to the table and placed the note once more under the watch. 2 minutes. 1.5. 1. With a sudden fearless cry he sprang into the very center of his prison and flung out his arms with his face to the hole next to the door. This time his voice was almost a shout. "Jean Croisset, there is a note under my watch on the table. After you have killed me, take it to Mélisse. If you fail, I shall hunt you to your grave." Still no sound, no gleam of steel pointing at aim through the black aperture. Would the shot come from behind? Tick, 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 tick. He counted the beating of his watch up to 20. A sound stopped him then, and he closed his eyes, and a great shiver passed through his body. It was the tiny bell of his watch tinkling off the hour of 6. Scarcely had that sound ceased to ring in his brain when from far through the darkness beyond the wall of his prison there came a creaking noise, as if a heavy door had been swung slowly on its hinges, or a trap opened. Then voices, low, quick, excited voices. The hurrying tread of feet, a flash of light shooting through the gloom. They were coming! After all, it was not to be a private affair, and Jean was to do his killing as the hangman's job is done in civilization, before a crowd. Howland's arms dropped to his side. This was more terrible than the other, this seeing and hearing of preparation, in which he fancied that he heard the click of Croisset's gun as he lifted the hammer. Instead, it was a hand fumbling at the door. There were no voices now, only a strange moaning sound that he could not account for.